and welcome once again to our study of The Path is the Goal by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And as usual, can everyone hear me? Thank you very much. So, I'm just going to go over the sections that we've covered so far. By the way, this is one of the famous beat poets that maybe quite a few of you might be familiar with, Allen Ginsberg, together with Trungpa Rinpoche in the, I guess, early 70s. So, in the context of the book here, the first section was then, you could say, with its three parts presented, we could say, ground, path, and fruition in terms of the practice of meditation. And then part two, where we presently are, then the first chapter was really understanding the nature, the mechanics of the confusion we're working with. That would actually be chapters 1 and 2. And then chapter 3, which we covered last time, was then rather precise instructions on the practice of, you could say, the spirit and the essential, which is really sort of subtle, the way that we approach meditation. And specifically then how we handle the focus, attention to the breath, but also the ways with which we do that. And then I just would like to say really that the text that we are studying here is around meditation. I did actually send out, you could say, a instruction in meditation as an attachment in one of the emails, but it should be noted that what we're looking at here is more understanding and approaching an understanding of meditation. Even though we discuss quite precise issues such as breath and so forth, this is not what we would consider meditation instruction. This, you could say, the practice, or rather meditation instruction, is generally something that we receive from someone living, someone another human being. So what we are studying here, you could say, does provide some indispensable advice. And it comes from someone who both knows the ins and outs of meditation as well as also the ins and outs of the human mind, knowing both, you could say, samsara and nirvana. And particularly then what is unusual about Trungpa Rinpoche is the degree to which he's familiar with the modern universe. And that is what we can call skillful means. See, Trungpa Rinpoche, he uses language and awareness of our culture to bring us to this simplicity of wisdom. We, wherever we are, whoever we are, need to relate to our beliefs, our habitual practices, in order for us to integrate our existing reality onto the path. The skill of a wisdom master like Trungpa Rinpoche is to first have the wisdom to see how both delusion and wisdom are present and reflected within the beliefs and practices of our culture, and then to skillfully enable these realities to become of the process of the students. And this has really characterized Buddhism wherever it has been, you could say, imported or transplanted, wherever it has happened. If that didn't happen, that actually we relate, which the teachers actually could relate to, you could say, the potential for both confusion and wisdom in the cultures wherever it arrived, then Buddhism would have just have been mechanically reproducing the ways of the perceived Buddhist orthodoxy of previous cultures, which actually was based on the particular practices and beliefs there, right? So we would have ended up just having, you could say, doing things like they were done in India 5 BC, endlessly. So seeing the living Dharma across times and culture, we have a master like Vijayadhara, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who doesn't change anything in the Dharma, you could say the sacred teaching as such, but rather makes sure that nothing is lost in translation. So pardon me, I just wanted to make that point. And we then have chapter 3, the portable stage set. So along those lines, like I just spoke about, we need to be aware of the baggage of our existing assumptions that we carry with us throughout life. And this is then what informs the attitudes that we bring into our experiences, situations, encounters with the world. It's on the basis of this then that we engage with our world on the basis of a certain personal stage set. As Rinpoche says, we constantly produce a display, a theatrical scene. Now the backdrop of such a stage is made up of basic space, say unconditional reality of whatever there is, and then our individual perceptions, which are colored by our moods. So with ourselves as the main actor, we orient ourselves about what is happening on the basis of this stage set, with, of course, equipped with, you could say, some self-centered antennas. Now, in Vipassana then, so that being a given, you could say this is something we humbly might admit, this is what we do, this is the reality of how we approach wherever we are, whatever we're doing. The thing that then we do in Vipassana is we look at the theatrical activity rather than getting involved or busy with it. So we observe the character of this display, however it might be. We do not have to feel, as we're sitting practicing meditation, we do not feel compelled to get involved. We could say meditation, in fact, is weaning ourselves off the inclination to always react. Also, this reactive pattern prevents us from actually properly perceiving what there is. Rather, we inquire and look at what is going on and how we are part of that. So this inquiry is not only theoretical. We develop first-hand awareness of this experience, we see how it affects us and what our instinctive involvement is, and we become more aware of the entire process. In Vipassana, we then experience the game that we set up, but we deal with it differently. Our familiar patterns occur, but we allow ourselves we do not allow ourselves to be caught in these patterns. I don't know if I mentioned, I was recently reading a really delightful and very profound work by one of Trungpa Rinpoche's students called Pema Chodron. It's called Taking the Leap. And she refers to her teacher Dzigakon Rinpoche and his identifying a phenomenon that in Tibetan is called Shenpa. And he actually leaves it untranslated very often. But it does mean that we fixate on particular things. We sort of have little things that sort of bring up the red light or some sort of gives us some sort of neurotic buzz. We fixate on particular issues. And sitting meditation actually enables that we could see beyond these fixations. As they arise, we appreciate you could say the tension that arises, but we go beyond that and referring to understanding this as part of our familiar baggage, the stage set, we are able to not get caught by it. So as we sit, we are alone with what we could say our energy, which Trungpa Rinpoche refers to as our radiation. Nothing toxic particularly, but really more just that there is, you could say, a glow that is our natural energy, natural warmth. And as we sit, we do not have any particular object or objective as we sit. So as such then this energy, the radiation, has no object. what all normally translates into us doing with a sense of stage set, being actors, and that whole dualistic setup, is then, you could say, short-circuited in that there is no audience, there's no one to impress. So we face and allow this natural radiance to unfold. We become familiar with what there is without having to engage in patterns of some object, someone else, some objective. As we sit, you could say we are our own audience. So as we sit then, you could say the practice of meditation also becomes a stage set. We could say meditation begins as a game. When we sit, we possibly become our own audience. We entertain ourselves with our games of being good meditators or bad meditators, good or bad students, etc. So our energy gets caught up in this daydream or role play. I, the meditator, I, the student, etc. And these new credentials that we construct, new identities. So this is where the practice of meditation is, that we wear this out. We gradually get over this as we sit. We want to free ourselves from these self-involved games. As we experience practice, we peel away these layers of, let's say, self-involvement. So there is a process that's indispensable, and this is where we need to actually sit down, relate to our breath, and this is what we call shamatha. Shamatha is indispensable. Without that, there can be no real wisdom, no real unfolding of a path. We have no meditation, we have no wisdom of vipassana without the sitting practice of shamatha. So it's only when we are fully there, fully present, as per shamatha, that we begin to sense this wider space, what is happening all at once. This is where we begin to see beyond just the portable stage set. And this is then where shamatha extends into vipassana. We're grounded, we're present, and we begin to see with an aerial perspective. This is then what we call the vipassana of panoramic awareness or vision. As we sit, we are aware of our radiation, and we sense this style vis-a-vis the world around us. It exists within the context of our world. In doing so, we sit alone and we experience this unfragmented energy. We have this aerial perspective which has no center. It doesn't even particularly belong to us. There's not necessarily an owner. So there is a sense that this is just thought. And with that we then have a wider sense of context. We experience the world in a decentralized way. We take in our experience of periphery as well as the center. Our radiation is a bit like a light bulb, which when it's switched on then illuminates the environment, not just some details. It radiates everywhere with no preferences. So this decentralized experience, this, you could say, panoramic awareness of vipassana, this is something that does not refer particularly to who is doing the lighting. We have what Trungpa Rinpoche calls then a wide open radiation without a radiator. If we shine a light on who is radiating, we won't be able to identify some singular unitary source or self. So as we sit then, we actually begin to see through the constructs of our, you could say, habitual ways of relating to things, and grounding ourselves, we then have this wider perspective, decentralized, wider perspective, a wide, open world. Now, Vipassana is a vast topic, and what we want to appreciate here is that we're talking about experience, we're talking about meditation. So, in doing that, we are not really getting into philosophy. This is quite important. And while Rinpoche just says actually that what we are presently trying to do is gain some understanding about a living experience of awareness. And he goes on to state that this is about getting over our games and conceptual reference point, this being the living experience of awareness. So Trungpa Rinpoche makes this point. This is something about feeling, experiencing. I thought to just say something about this because, of course, all of us find ourselves in various, you could say, Dharma environments, and there's various approaches, and sometimes there is a lot of emphasis just on study, sometimes a lot of emphasis just on teaching and so forth, and we'd want to actually appreciate the unified vision of all of this. You could say that everything that we've come across in the Buddhist teaching in terms of insight and wisdom, Rigpa, natural condition, TGS, ordinary mind, Prajna Paramita, Madhyamika, all of these Mahamudra, Dzogchen teachings, and all of that is about this Vipassana, this insight. It's about us becoming a little bit wiser, a little bit less confused, uprooting the cause of suffering. So whether we're studying the logic of wisdom, and that can be, you could say, very helpful, particularly for us who come from a very analytical culture. This actually enables us to see that we're dealing with, you could say, reality. This is founded not on some mantra or self-hypnosis that just makes us feel good, but this is actually about getting to really into the depth of our reality and clearing up confusion, and you could say adapting ourselves or becoming aware of our reality inside as well as externally. So understanding the logic of it makes a lot of sense. But we do need to have this element then of experience, practice. This is ultimately what we're about to do. We're not just engaging in intellectual thoughts and ideas. We're always coming back to this living experience of awareness. Now in the Chögyam Nyingma tradition, and also in the Sakya and the Gelug, of course, but there seems to be some emphasis in the Chögyam Nyingma tradition that all study is done in conjunction with actual experience. I don't actually know if this is uniquely Tibetan or it also spills into Western context. I'm a little bit more familiar with the Chögyam Nyingma environment. I can confirm, having lived in the Sakya monastery, that yes, there is a lot of emphasis for some of the students, particularly in like colleges and the like, to really just focus on study. They do this with incredible diligence, actually. But indeed, there is not that much emphasis on practice in such places. So maybe in a traditional context, this is more pronounced. In the Western context, I actually don't know. But the point is, we could easily get up in the dense dialectics of philosophy, the logic, the reasonings, and so forth, and it could be a bit like drinking salt water. We could become addicted to the studies of Madhyamika, Prajna Paramita, and even actually in the context of Dzogchen and Mahamudra, you see people who actually are not particularly inclined to meditate, but very delighted with just the sort of glib slogans that come with some of these profound teachings. So it is only when we relate these teachings to living experience that the words then are helpful. We would want to combine, you could say, the sharpness of study with a solid grounding in shamatha that is then the basis for our experience of a wide open awareness of vipassana. Now vipassana extends beyond the self. It is awareness particularly of a much wider experience of other. So we are aware not particularly of ourselves but more of the other. Otherwise, with just awareness of ourself, we have this infinitude of self-absorption. What is it? Trungpa Rinpoche refers to this as rather incestuous, the self watching a self, watching the self that's watching a self, etc. And we need to get over that, and we need to have a wider perspective. With that wider perspective, then, we have a welcoming, compassionate gesture towards the other, towards that. There's no judgment, there is just being with what is. So this seems to be the basic approach or basic policy in insight meditation, vipassana. So at this point then we conclude chapter 3, the present chapter. And I'd like to encourage you to actually have a look at the questions. I'm going to just quickly go through the questions that we find, and these are not even the wording particularly of the questions, but it's really just sort of an index of what the topics these questions are about, what they touch on. So the first is a question from the student about how about the radiation without a radiator, and he then asked this to Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and I actually will abstain from summarizing the answer, not because of even time restraint, just because I'm not even sure I could do justice to the answers he gave. So the second question is, what about awareness of other? And what determines our actions? Yes, this is a question about what it is that you could say, how we deal with, interact with space and the others and so forth. And someone brings up the question about the previous analogy about the tree. Where are we at in terms of that? How does panoramic awareness alter our relationship to our thoughts? So we talk about how it exists in terms of the other and space, but how about our own thoughts? And then someone notices or comments that after meditation they go back to acting. And Trungpa Rinpoche, he has great answers for that. And then also one of the students say, I'm enjoying the theater, and you seem to be part of the theater as well. That again is also quite an interesting exchange. Then someone, slightly possibly a moralistic angle, then asks if this theater is not based on our self-importance. And then there's an interesting question, which is, how come you don't emphasize the jhanas, the levels of absorption? And I actually thought to just comment on that or summarize, and I would really encourage you to read the extensive answer in there. But Trungpa Rinpoche, and I kind of want to bring this up also because my own teachers seem to adopt a similar approach, which is that there's not particularly this need for absorption. This practice of absorbing oneself is quite common, not just in Buddhism, also in various Hindu traditions. But ultimately this is something that one needs to relinquish. This in itself is a cause of addiction and samsara. So Trungpa Rinpoche suggests that we could remain free of these addictive, pleasurable conditions, the jhanas, and go straight to vipassana. Jhanas famously in the classical scriptures also refer to, you could say, extended conditions of shamatha, in which the student actually just remains suspended in no thought but also no real clarity. And so in my own case, my own teachers, they seem to have adopted the same approach, not creating too much fuss with regards to these absorptions, these meditative states. And then the last one is, how can I distinguish between shamatha and vipassana? So this is really just to encourage all of you to have a look at the question and answer sessions. Any questions from persons here? Is this connection between the theory and practice, i.e. being content with the philosophy and not necessarily practice, what the Tibetans call a Dharma bear? I've never heard that, actually. A Dharma bear? That is possible. That would be Chögyam. No, actually, this distinction is very often referred to as, you have actually the two extremes. You see, the one is you have the crazy intellectual on one hand, the sort of highly stimulated intellectual on way too much caffeine, on, what is it, steroids? And the other is the dull meditator, the stupid meditator. So either of these two extremes are obviously to be avoided. So we try to combine the two. But yes, I haven't run into a Dharma bear. Alright, no other questions? Okay, we'll do some question and answers afterwards. So chapter 4, boredom, full or empty. And I'm actually tempted here tonight. I'm not too much in a hurry. You see, some of you who have followed the study sessions we've had know that sometimes there has been a lot of stuff crammed in this 1 hour, and very often I extend beyond the normative 1 hour, and I'm actually thinking we have some time here tonight. So actually, since we are talking about experience and we are going to be discussing boredom, I would actually just suggest that we actually take this possibly virtual, but also for some of us it is real time, this occasion to actually just sit quietly. I hope that's alright. I hope that's legit. But just have a moment when where we're sitting and not really doing anything relating to being present. So let's just do that just for a few minutes. Unheard of in previous sessions, but I think it's okay we do that. So we'll just sit. Thank you. And this little moment of sitting hopefully brings home the, you could say, immediate experience of being right here and being present. And the theme of boredom is, of course, very real in for those who practice meditation. See, if we're, you could say, faithful Buddhists, not even necessarily the intellectual variety we discussed before, but just someone who has faith in the path, we might actually follow a teacher and, you could say, be committed and even do all sorts of, you could say, practices of skillful means without ever really experiencing doing nothing. And that's rather a shame, because when we don't actually have that, then we don't actually touch on some, you could say, unconditional quality that's really essential. We could say actually all the skillful means that we have in the Buddhist tradition, they are actually enabling us to integrate this unconditional dimension in our meditation, but also in our post-meditation. So this sitting and not doing anything is very valuable. And as we then sit, there is obviously the experience of, you could say, it's intense. But then again, it's also not the intensity of being stimulated or confirmed or, you could say, entertained. So we have this, the present chapter, if I may, attempt to, you could say, interpret the title, full or empty, this space in which nothing happens and which is going to be, you could say, celebrated, praised, validated, this boredom. That experience of sitting, we can both have a very, you could say, experience of full and sense of intensity, or also empty in the case that, well, we're not getting our usual entertainment, our usual engagement, our usual challenge. So, as we approach this, there is a very real element of this experiential quality of actually just sitting, and all of a sudden our usual habitual storylines are actually suspended. We're actually engaging with reality, where we are, without necessarily this stage set going up. So it's there that we begin to actually experience and have some sense of what it is that we're doing on the path. And this is what we could call contacting lineage, having some sense of experiencing lineage from within. We would call absolute lineage, our heritage or Buddha nature. And this also then enables us to begin to appreciate the lineage as it comes to us from, you could say, our guru or teacher, and also from the Buddhist tradition. All of a sudden we begin to actually know what they're talking about. Now, this is not just, you could say, intended to just say something, but it's really an important point. And this boredom, as far as my own journey has been concerned, this is a very important point. And it is something also that has distinguished, you could say, Trungpa Rinpoche's approach to meditation, where his students have actually had to sit and relate properly to themselves. And this is not always the case in the, you could say, importation of Buddhism into the modern world. And so very often people have commented on the practice of boredom as it exists within Trungpa Rinpoche's lineage, and there is some awareness about this approach. This is very important, because we are obviously really, we could say Trungpa Rinpoche comes from a place of really thinking that, and really intending that the students could actually gain some realization. So there has to be this grounding, this proper experience. And then in terms of what we're talking about here, then, vipassana, meditation, we appreciate then what is the objective of the path, which is not just us being busy with some Buddhist stuff, but it is actually beginning to relinquish our insecure addiction to us as the center of the universe. This is about Vipassana enabling us to develop some knowledge of selflessness, what is then referred to as anatman or dogma in Tibetan. Now, this doesn't mean that we just disappear or anything, not at all. It actually means that we begin to take off our shades, our filters, and begin to open up to the world. But without this experience of how this self is non-existent, then without that we cannot really have this experience of wisdom which enables us to relate to the wider world, this awareness of Vipassana. With the experience of how the self is non-existent, we are freer in our world. We're not burdened by ourselves as, you could say, sort of filtering, interpreting, judging the world. We see more clearly. And when there is no self, then there ceases to be this analytical, or rather when we experience this, then the idea of no self, it ceases to be an analytical fact. It's not just philosophy, it becomes felt experience. And we're not really thinking of selflessness as some sort of moral obligation that we might have. It's really something that's innate to our experience. As practitioners of meditation, we have this experience of non-aggression. We actually are not that driven by our thoughts that arise. We begin to experience the transparency of the stage set. And in this way, we begin to engage with the world in a more free and open and compassionate way. We can say compassion happens naturally when there is no self getting in the way. So compassion is something that manifests organically. It's innate, you could say, to selflessness. We could say that in terms of touching on this very heart of the path, then there is a dawn of a much greater insight, a much greater wisdom. And Vipassana as such, then, this wisdom is awareness of the space where we are. While the mindfulness of shamatha, our technique, is quite precise, what comes out of that, what grows out of that, is this awareness of Vipassana that is panoramic and open. So our experience of mindfulness, shamatha, includes then awareness of the space surrounding the breath. This is then what you could say where mindfulness opens into Vipassana. Now as we sit then, and in general, living with our experience of who we are, then we have the grip of our emotions. We have our fixations, the shenpa that I was referring to previously, and also this experience of how thoughts become fixations that become then emotions. So we actually cannot free ourselves unless we see the context or the reference point or the space where these emotions are happening. So as we sit then, we begin to look at this space of the emotions. We see that they're taking place within, right here, within this space where we are. So we understand emotions in terms of the space or environment where they're happening. And when that happens, then our, you could say, ordinary struggle with emotions becomes, then our ordinary struggle becomes irrelevant. And as such, then our relationships with our emotions becomes less intense. And remedying emotions become less heavy-handed. So this is where meditation then works as an antidote to the afflictions of our emotions. So we should have this experience how thoughts fuse with space. As we go out with the out-breath in our awareness, the focus dissipates within the atmosphere. And as we understand that this is not just during the time that we're sitting, then we begin to appreciate how thoughts just needs to be allowed to dissolve into this wider awareness. So we appreciate how thoughts diffuse within a greater totality. Yet, we might be so wrapped up in ourselves we miss this point, and this is where I can't help thinking of a quote that's attributed to Ben Franklin, who says, "A man wrapped up in himself makes a very small bundle." So I think we intuit the point of that, and here we'd want to appreciate that meditation is what brings us back and out of that particular narrowness. When we're caught up in our little self-involved bundle, then we are not really present. We're caught up in our thoughts, and coming out of that also is coming out of this narrow gorge. So the thing is, we are not brought back to some particular state. We are just relinquishing any involvement in these narrow spaces, but it's not as if we then have a new space that we go into. So this unconditional quality is what we could refer to as the scope of vipassana. So it's not something that can be grasped. We just come back. So we students, we relinquish this game of manipulation as we connect with what is present. And then we begin to see this totality. We might ask the question then, we might get philosophical, what is this whole thing? And this is then answered by Trungpa Rinpoche, who says it's nothing particularly. We could say that vipassana is the experience of the whole thing, right? A sage is someone who is wise, who knows, who has that vision of totality. The thing is that there's not some piece of information. There's not something that is an object of the grasping mind. So this quality of totality doesn't have a name, and in fact we could say that why we can see the whole clearly is that we are not fixating on any particular experience or relating back to something that is grasped by me. This wider perspective, without a name, does not exist on the premises of our ordinary objectification or grasping, or our habitual patterns. What Trungpa Rinpoche refers to it as is basic accommodation. There is space, and phenomena can unfold in this space. But as far as ourselves and our strategies goes, there's actually nothing in it for us. This space accommodates all our activity, but there is a very decentralized quality about this space. So this accommodation, rather than our usual busyness, is antithetical to our insecurity. And while we might want to do something with this space, that is actually just because we're bored. We might even get agitated. Here we are, and nothing's happening. This unconditional quality makes us agitated. It's as if we want to do something with this space. So this is where we have this discussion of being bored. We want to fill up space. We can't stand that there's nothing going on. Actually, one of my friends, his daughter says, one reason I never want to be a Buddhist is because, one, I have to be quiet, two, there's nothing happening. I have to just sit there. So that and a few other very, how do you say, substantiated arguments is completely actually understandable. We can kind of rejoice in that kind of intelligence. And possibly it is sort of pregnant with just the awareness of this situation. Actually, that kind of attitude is pregnant with the insight of the value of this non-activity. Anyway, let's see. But we appreciate that basic space is free from objects, it's free from activity, and there's nothing in it for us. So we're bored. We have various kinds of boredoms, which is lack of incitement, there's nothing going on, and so forth. But here, this unconditional space that we have, free from activity, it's wide open, has nothing about it that we need to do. So settling here actually comes with a very important quality, which is that there is no occupation for me. There is an idleness from that sense, and we can perhaps appreciate its value. This is then what Trungpa Rinpoche calls unconditional boredom. There's simply nothing in it for us. However, and this is very important because like when we have no excitement, nothing's happening, then we actually begin to space out and we become kind of self-involved and dull. And this is where we want to appreciate this boredom that we're talking about here to a kind of pervasive thick cream. It's something that has, you could say, texture and also a fluidity. And what's particular about it is that it's challenging. There's nothing indulgent about it, and also we don't really have any chance of becoming spaced out. Think about when we are bored and then we are spacing out and we are ungrounded and so forth, is that there actually is a lack of being alive. We are not grounded, we are empty-handed, empty-hearted. And when that happens, then emotions come along, we're very fragile, and things come up and we're easily freaked out. So it's important that to understand that Vipassana is not this kind of empty-heartedness. It's very real. It is grounded in our personal sanity and presence within unconditional reality. So this extends beyond just our meditation, just our sitting. Right now, for example, we're sitting here, and Trungpa Rinpoche gives the example of him giving a lecture, but in the case of us sitting around here, we are listening to myself. There's a PowerPoint, and there's the various attitudes about what we're doing and so forth. You might have attitudes about the presentation, the lecture, and so forth, but there's also a decentralized perspective about what is happening, something like a greater aerial perspective that is not about us. And this awareness, which extends beyond us, which is then, you could say, awareness of Vipassana, it enables us to relate to such a wider experience of the reality. And this is where Trungpa Rinpoche introduces this notion of that. And thatness is, you could say, a little bit like the other. We get out of ourselves, which is this, and we begin to be aware of something wider, which is then that. The vivid experience of that is sometimes referred to as luminosity. Some might object, we can't talk about something, because luminosity also can be synonymous with Buddha nature, and some might object, we can't talk about that in such a domestic context, but actually Trungpa Rinpoche does, and we'd want to appreciate that the quality, the potential, the quality of this experience is with us all the time. Otherwise we have nowhere actually to begin. So we want to be aware how this vivid experience of that is sometimes referred to as luminosity. When we hear about luminosity, this decentralized awareness is what we can call luminosity. It is a basic all-pervasiveness that is immersed in reality and doesn't necessarily have any particular loyalty to the self, to this. So our awareness is not even particularly securing our own, you could say, purpose or benefit. This quality extends beyond ourselves. Trungpa Rinpoche says, from this point of view, this or the self is long forgotten. So, this, me, might struggle, but there is just so much of that. It's like in the Lojong teaching we say there's very few of me and there's a lot of everyone else. So we perceive this vaster space, and this is where you could say the sense of this loses itself in the midst of that. It's vast. So there is in this no place for a fragmented, singular self or this. The self is not being catered to, and it's a bit like there's an element of suffocation. This discomfort then becomes boredom, and we're not feeding this centralized sense of me, this sort of this, and we're rather surrendering to a decentralized that, and this then leads us to vipassana. So we have this process of experience where we have vipassana not as a strategy about me and my enlightenment, but experiencing how enlightenment is present in the absence of fixating on me, and just, you could say, relinquishing our addiction to the me, going out with the out-breath. Then already there we are, one, touching on something vast and that is much greater, and having, you could say, panoramic awareness of vipassana, and it's also not something that exists on the premise of me. So you could say enlightenment in itself, from the ego's point of view, is possibly interesting, but it's also interesting that the ego actually won't be there to celebrate enlightenment. Hence you could say we don't have a sage that all of a sudden becomes excited because he or she achieves enlightenment. There's liberation, but there's not sort of this sense of, wow, I'm wonderful because I'm enlightened. If the Dalai Lama was like that, we probably might not have that much respect or appreciation. So we appreciate this egoless quality of vipassana. Again, we are not doing something that is speculative or hypothetical. This is not theory. We're not talking about something extraordinary. We are talking about something that happens naturally. It happens in our experience. We have these moments in which we are possibly more expansive, accommodating, tolerant, and so forth, but we might not necessarily recognize their value, and that in fact in and of itself could be genuine vipassana. We're not all of a sudden going, wow, I just did a random act of kindness there. So we don't have that kind of grasping. And so anyway, this is really just describing the value of vipassana. Just again to go through the Q&A, I'm just going to essentially give you the index of the topics that are touched upon in the Q&A, and so you might hopefully find, hopefully you want to read that. Question 1, and by the way also I have as usual references to page numbers and so forth. Some experiences of openness might not be boring. In fact, the opposite. First question. Question 2, in describing the above process, we just actually here at the very end alluded to suffocation, boredom, openness. Can we say that boredom is a gut response to the fear of losing oneself? Question 3, when you get startled while meditating, is that a sign of openness? How does awareness of body and atmosphere differ from awareness of the theater backdrop? Question 5, is the kind of boredom of vipassana different from the boredom that comes with beginning to sit, or when we begin to sit? Question 6, so boredom is not about relating to empty space, but how about relating to a full space and atmosphere? What do you mean in your reference to boundary? See, this actually question is where I'm humbled. I actually wouldn't be able to properly convey exactly what it is Trungpa Rinpoche refers to there. It's an extended discussion, very interesting. But presently I'm sort of baffled by that. Anyway, That being said, very often when we come across study of Dharma, there's something that just baffles us, we don't really get, and actually quite good if they kind of just sit and gnaws at you and irritates you. That very often becomes a source of insight, possibly. Question 9. Is labeling experience and going back to shamatha another escape? Question 8. Would a further vipassana mean breaking some boundaries? Question 9. Should we say fullness rather than emptiness? And the last question, does our neurosis ultimately come back to questioning our existence? So these are quite good, sophisticated questions and really worth exploring. Actually, yes, not only the answers I can't do justice to, even the questions actually I can't say I'm doing justice to. But anyway. So, there's a question. Do not have voice now? Oh. Oh, this question came at the time when we were sitting. So there was quiet. That's right. We were just sitting, meditating. So there was around, yes, just about half an hour ago we were just sitting. No voice then. Could it be said that a distraction is a form of directed or activated boredom? This seems to be more of a prevalent issue now that the spaced-out consequence of non-presentness. Well, if we follow distraction, then yeah, that is being, you could say, driven by our boredom. This is where boredom is not, you could say, seen through, but actually it drives us. So if we sit and sustain daydream, that is definitely where we can't take the heat. Actually, Trungpa Rinpoche, in talking about boredom, talks about the initial discomfort, a bit like suffocating, like when we're in a sauna. So yes, we maybe can't take it, and then we sit and have daydreams. But that's very much a choice to some extent. So where we sometimes drift with boredom, then we'd want to, we drift with distraction. Boredom is actually when we're not distracted. This seems to be more of a prevalent issue now than the spaced-out consequence of non-presentness. Well, I guess that's possibly in an individual context that we are being present and we're then bored, and then we'd want to choose daydream or distraction. Actually, I'm not sure I understand the last part of this question. Anyway, as far as the first goes, distraction, I would say when it's conscious that we are just following daydreams, that could be a choice, a conscious choice that we refuse to be bored. But other than that, I think it's not necessarily distraction is a problem in the sense of boredom. It's more that the whole meditation, you could say, project as such is not necessarily blissful as per our expectations. That's, I think, is more the issue really. So we want to appreciate that if we do fitness, it involves some sweat, and if we do meditation, there is this, you could say, commitment to boredom. No other questions? Okay. Then all that remains is just to say that the next chapter, the next chapters for next time are then 5 and 6, from raw eggs to stepping stones and loneliness. So thank you for attending this study, and yes, have a good evening or day wherever you are on the planet. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, May all beings be freed. Thank you.